My daughter told me not to come for Christmas. Not in a soft way. Not in a, "Mom, this year is complicated," kind of way. She said it the way you say something to someone you've already decided doesn't matter anymore. Flat. Certain. Like she'd rehearsed it, and was relieved to finally say it out loud. I was standing in my kitchen holding a casserole dish I'd just finished wrapping in foil when she called. I'd spent 3 hours on that dish. Sweet potato and rosemary. Her favorite since she was 9 years old. I'd even tied a ribbon around the foil because I knew she'd have guests, and I wanted it to look nice when I walked in. She didn't know about the ribbon. She didn't know about the dish. And apparently she didn't care. "Mom, I need you to not come this year." I didn't say anything for a moment. I thought I'd misheard her. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she continued, "and I just think the dynamic is better when it's just us. Just our circle. You understand?" I didn't understand. But I told her I did, because in that moment, I was too stunned to say anything else. What I didn't tell her was what had happened 3 weeks before that call. What I didn't tell her was what was already in motion. And I certainly didn't tell her that 6 weeks from that moment, she would be calling me from a number I didn't recognize, leaving voicemails I almost didn't listen to, asking me, begging me, actually, to please call her back. She had no idea what she'd just done. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because that Christmas phone call wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment I stopped pretending I hadn't seen what was coming. My daughter's name is Renee. She's 34. She married a man named Colin 5 years ago, and from the moment that wedding happened, something shifted in her that I still have trouble fully explaining. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual. The kind of slow drift that you keep making excuses for until one day you realize you've been making excuses for 4 years straight. She started pulling away from me shortly after the wedding. Fewer calls. Shorter visits. The kind of politeness that's actually colder than silence because it comes with just enough warmth to make you feel like you're imagining the distance. I told myself it was normal. New marriage. New life. New priorities. I gave her space. I gave her time. I gave her the benefit of every doubt I had. What I didn't give her was the truth about who I was. That was my mistake. And it was a significant one. Here's what Renee knew about me. She knew I'd worked in local government for most of her childhood. She knew I drove a sensible car and lived in a small house in a neighborhood she described, once, without thinking, as not really anywhere. She knew I clipped coupons, kept a budget, wore the same winter coat for 6 years, and said things like, "We'll see," when she asked for expensive things when she was a teenager. What she didn't know, what I'd never seen a reason to broadcast, was that for the past 11 years, I had been quietly building something that had nothing to do with any of that. I'll get to what that was. But first I need you to understand what Christmas Eve looked like for me without her. I put the casserole in the refrigerator. I unwrapped the ribbon from the foil and set it on the counter. I sat at my kitchen table for probably 40 minutes without doing anything. I'm not going to dramatize that moment more than it deserves. It hurt. It was the kind of hurt that doesn't announce itself loudly. It just settles in somewhere behind your chest and sits there, heavy and quiet. Then I got up, poured myself a glass of water, and made a decision. Not a reactive decision. Not a dramatic one. Just a clear one. I decided that I was done making myself smaller so that Renee could feel more comfortable with the version of me she'd invented. I decided that the thing I had been protecting, partly out of privacy and partly, if I'm honest, out of old habit, the thing I had built quietly, carefully, over more than a decade, was no longer something I needed to hide. Not because I wanted revenge. At least, that's not how I thought about it then. I thought about it as simply deciding to stop disappearing. What happened after that was not something I planned in any dramatic sequence. It was more like a series of doors I'd kept closed that I simply chose to open. And once they were open, what was behind them was impossible to ignore. The first door opened on December 27th. I had a standing appointment that week with a woman named Patricia, who works for a regional news outlet that covers human interest and community stories. We'd been in contact for about 2 months at that point. She'd reached out to me through a professional channel I won't go into yet, and we'd been having preliminary conversations about a story she wanted to develop. I'd been hesitant. Private, as I said, by nature. But after Christmas Eve, the hesitation was gone. I called Patricia on the 27th and told her I was ready. She said, "Are you sure?" "Once this runs, it runs," I said. "I'm sure." We scheduled the interview for January 9th. Now, while all of that was happening, Renee was having what I can only describe as a lovely holiday. I know this because Colin's sister, Maureen, who has always been quietly kind to me in ways Renee probably didn't notice, sent me a message on the 28th. She meant it innocently. She said, "Hope you're doing well, we missed having you around." She included a photo from Christmas dinner. Renee was at the head of the table. She was laughing. She looked relaxed in a way I recognized as the specific relaxation that comes from having removed something stressful from your environment. I was the thing she'd removed. I saved the photo. Not out of bitterness, but because it clarified something for me. She wasn't conflicted. She wasn't quietly sad about her decision. She'd made her choice, and she was comfortable with it. That mattered. It told me I wasn't dealing with a complicated woman in a hard season. I was dealing with a woman who had decided, fully and consciously, that I was less than what she needed me to be. She was wrong about that. And January was going to prove it in a way I couldn't have scripted better if I'd tried. The interview with Patricia ran on January 14th. It was a 12-minute segment. Local news, but syndicated to 3 regional affiliates, and picked up the same afternoon by 2 digital platforms with significant reach. The story was about a program I had built. I want to be specific here because the specificity matters. A community housing initiative I'd started 11 years ago with $4,000 of my own money, a spare bedroom I'd converted into an office, and a contact list I'd assembled over 22 years of government work. By the time Patricia interviewed me, that program had placed 340 families into stable housing. We had a staff of 9. We had a budget, for that fiscal year, of $1.3 million. We had letters from the governor's office. We had a national nonprofit designation we'd held for 6 years. We had a waiting list of 200 families and a gala coming up in March that had already sold $80,000 in tables. None of that was secret. All of it was public record, attached to my name, findable by anyone who looked. Renee had never looked. That was the thing. She'd built a story about who I was and she'd never once questioned whether it was accurate. The segment was warm. Patricia is good at her job. She framed it around the families, around the mission, around what the program had meant to the community. My name and my face were on it clearly, but the focus was the work. That's how I wanted it. What I didn't anticipate, or maybe I did quietly, in the way you anticipate things you don't want to admit you're hoping for, was how fast it moved. By the evening of January 14th, the segment had been shared on 3 different community Facebook groups in Renee's neighborhood. I know this because, again, Maureen. She sent me a screenshot with a string of fire emojis and the words, "Did you know about this?" which I took to mean she hadn't. By the morning of January 15th, a woman from Renee's church had tagged Renee directly in one of the shares, with the comment, "Isn't this your mom? This is incredible." Renee didn't respond to that comment. By the afternoon of January 15th, I had 14 missed calls. 12 from numbers I recognized, colleagues, old friends, people from the community I hadn't spoken to in months. 2 from numbers I didn't recognize. By the evening of January 15th, one of those unknown numbers had left a voicemail. I almost didn't listen to it. When I pressed play, I heard my daughter's voice. She didn't say her name. She started in the middle, the way you do when you've already rehearsed what you're going to say and you're trying to get it out before you lose your nerve. "Mom, it's me. I just wanted to, I think we should talk. Can you call me back? Or I can call you back. Please call me." Her voice had a quality I'd never heard in it before. Not guilt, exactly. Not quite. Something closer to the specific panic of someone who realizes, too late, that they misread the entire room. I set the phone down and thought about it for a while. Here's what I want to be honest about. I did not call her back that night. Not because I was being calculated. Not because I was executing some kind of strategy. But because I needed to sit with that voicemail and decide what I actually wanted. Not what I was supposed to want, not what the right maternal response was supposed to be. What I specifically wanted. And what I wanted was not a quick phone call that allowed her to normalize everything before she'd had a chance to understand what had actually happened. She called again on the 16th. Twice, both from the blocked number. She called on the 17th from a number I recognized as Colin's cell. I didn't answer. Colin left no message. On the 18th, Maureen called, from her own number, openly, and I answered. Maureen is not a complicated person. She said. Renee is losing her mind. I think you should know that. I thanked her. She said. Whatever you're doing, I think it's right. Then she told me that Renee had apparently been at a dinner party 2 nights before where 3 different people had brought up the news segment. One of them had asked Renee if she'd been involved in the work. Renee had said yes, broadly, in a way that was not accurate. Someone at the table had pulled up the segment on their phone and read part of it aloud. My name. My history. 11 years. 340 families. Renee had gone quiet for the rest of the dinner. I want to pause here and tell you something, because I think it's important. I have never, in Renee's life, used money or position as a weapon. Not once. I drove a sensible car because I chose to. I kept a budget because that's how I built what I built. The house in the neighborhood that was not really anywhere was paid off in full in 2019, and it has a value I won't share because that's not the point. The point is that I made choices, deliberately, about what I displayed and what I didn't, because I didn't believe those things were the measure of a person and I didn't want Renee to grow up believing they were. The irony is that she grew up believing exactly that anyway. And she applied that belief to me. She looked at the surface of my life and decided she knew the depth of it. She found the surface modest, so she concluded the depth was too. She was wrong by a margin she had not prepared for. The gala in March, the one that had already sold $80,000 in tables, was where the second, larger wave of this happened. But before I get there, I need to tell you about the letter. On January 21st, I received a handwritten letter from Renee. 4 pages. I'm not going to read you the whole thing because some of it is private, and some of it is not something I want to turn into entertainment. But I'll tell you the shape of it. The first page was apology. Genuine, I think, or at least genuinely felt in the moment. She said she hadn't known. She said she was sorry for Christmas. She said she'd been influenced, her word, by Colin's family's perception of things and that she'd let that perception override her own judgment. The second page was justification. This is where she explained, at some length, why she had done what she'd done and why, in context, it made sense. I read this page twice. I didn't agree with her reasoning, but I understood it. She'd constructed a hierarchy in her mind, a social architecture of who mattered and who didn't, and she'd put me at the bottom of it without ever verifying whether her data was correct. The third page was a request. She wanted to have dinner. She wanted to reconnect. She suggested a restaurant she knew I'd find impressive, which told me she was still, even then, thinking in terms of surfaces. The fourth page was the one that stayed with me. It was shorter than the others. She wrote, I think I've been embarrassed by things that weren't actually embarrassing. I think I confused quiet with small. I don't know when I started doing that. That line I believed. That one I thought she actually meant. I didn't respond to the letter immediately. I held on to it. The gala was March 8th. We held it at a venue downtown, a building with a rooftop terrace that a donor had offered us for cost, which was nothing. 720 people attended. The governor's deputy chief of staff was there. 3 city council members. A news crew from a station larger than the one that had run the January piece. A table of 14 from a foundation that had just committed a 6-figure grant to fund our expansion into 2 neighboring counties. I wore a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. I'm not a person who talks about what I wear, but I want you to understand that I walked into that room as the full version of myself and not one modified inch of the performance I'd been unconsciously giving for years. Renee was not there. She hadn't been invited. Not as a punishment. The event was ticketed and she'd had no connection to the work, so there was no reason she would be. But she saw photographs. The photographs went up on our organization's social media that night and the next morning. By the 9th, we'd been tagged in over 300 posts. Colin's mother, a woman named Diane who had been at Renee's Christmas dinner and who had, I later learned, been one of the primary architects of the Renee's mother is sweet but not really relevant narrative. Diane was at a brunch on March 9th where someone showed her the photos on a phone. I know this because Maureen was at that brunch and Maureen called me that afternoon, barely holding it together, to tell me that Diane had gone very quiet and then excused herself from the table. Renee called me that same afternoon. Her own number this time. Not blocked. I answered. She said my name and then she didn't say anything for a moment. I waited. I need to tell you something, she said finally. I've been wrong about a lot of things. Not just Christmas. Before that. For a long time. And I think I've been wrong in a way that was cruel, even if I didn't intend it to be cruel, and I'm sorry. I let the silence sit for a second before I responded. I said, I know. I said, and I need you to understand that I'm not angry. But I'm also not able to just step back into the position I was in before. That position, the one where I made myself easier for you to dismiss, I don't fit there anymore. Maybe I never should have. She was quiet. Then she said, I know. I think that's what I'm starting to understand. We talked for almost 2 hours. It was hard and honest and real in a way that our conversations hadn't been in years. I'm not going to tell you we fixed everything that night. We didn't. But we started something that had a different foundation than what came before. Not built on her version of me. Built on the actual one. Now let me tell you what I didn't tell her on that call, what I still haven't told her, because it belongs to me and I'm not ready to share it yet. The program we've built is in the process of a national replication effort. 3 cities. Federal funding conversations that began in February. A book proposal from a publisher that contacted me after the January segment. A seat on an advisory board that puts me in rooms with people making decisions that affect hundreds of thousands of lives. None of that happened because of her. None of it will be changed by her. It exists because of 11 years of quiet, unglamorous, consistent work that I did while she was busy constructing a hierarchy I never appeared in. I'm in it now. Not because I need her to see it. But because I stopped agreeing to be invisible. And the thing is, the thing that still sits with me on quiet evenings, is that none of this was revenge. I know how it looks. I know what this story sounds like from the outside. But I didn't take those steps to hurt her. I took them because that phone call on Christmas Eve was the moment I finally decided to stop editing myself for an audience that hadn't earned the performance. She told me not to come for Christmas. 6 weeks later she was calling from a blocked number, leaving a voicemail she almost didn't leave, asking me to please call her back. And 720 people were about to sit down at tables and raise money for something I'd built in a house in a neighborhood that was not really anywhere. I think about that casserole dish sometimes. Still in my refrigerator on Christmas Eve. Still wrapped in foil with the ribbon on top. I ate it myself over the next 3 days, alone at my kitchen table with the news on in the background, and I'll tell you something, it was the best I'd ever made it. Some things taste different when you stop saving them for people who don't deserve them.